Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Janice Law. I'm the founder of American Women Writers National Museum. We're a nonprofit. We're 11 years old, and our mission is to honor America's great women writers, historic and contemporary. Some of the women that we have honored in the past are women in early TV, women in early radio, Eudora Welty, let's see, also Toni Morrison, many Black poets, Black screenwriters, Hispanic poets. We've honored all groups of women. So today I want to introduce Mary Jane Apple. In 1997, Mary Jane joined the Library of Congress team, which was tasked with digitizing the historic archives of photos taken across America by a team of photographers between 1935 and 1943 as part of a documentary government project of the Farm Security Administration. Drawing on how that research resulted in her new book, she's going to speak. Her book is entitled Russell Lee, A Photographer's Life and Legacy. She's going to speak to us about how and why this particular talent of photographer Russell Lee stood out as a member of the Farm Security Administration team. And she's going to talk about the details of Lee's biography and highlights from Lee's vast contribution of 23,000 photographs to the Farm Administration Project. Ms. Apple holds a BFA degree in photography and art history from Seton Hill College, and she also holds an MA in history of photography from the University of New Mexico, where she is now working on her doctorate degree. The Autumn also honors has a 50-state project. For every month, we honor women from 4 states. This month, we're honoring women from Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, and Nevada. So I'm going to sign off my photo. I'll be back later to give you Mary Jane Apple. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice, for having me here today. I'm excited to share the story of my 20-year journey researching and writing this book about Russell Lee and the photographs he made for the Farm Security Administration Office of War Information, or FSA OWI, or just FSA for short. I'd like to start with a few words about the FSA. The FSA was a government photography project that documented America during the Great Depression and early years of World War II. Around 20 photographers worked for the FSA, and between 1935 and 1943, they shot about 175,000 photographs. These photographs, which we now know as the FSA OWI collection, are in the Prints and Photographs Division at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. As Janice mentioned, I first got interested in the FSA and Russell Lee's work in particular in 1997 when I took a job right out of graduate school working on a project to digitize the FSA OWI collection at the Library of Congress. At that time, the collection was not available online as it is now. You could only view it if you came in person to the Prints and Photographs Division reading room. And even then, you could only see the printed portion of the collection, about 77,000 file prints like the one I'm showing you here on the right. And the file prints were, and they still are, organized in rows of filing cabinets. And on the left, I'm showing you just one row of those cabinets. I want to add here that the research photographs I'm showing you today, like these two, are not in the book. So my job in 1997 was to match the file prints to the negatives for the digitization project. I spent hundreds of hours at those file cabinets looking at thousands of file prints. And I studied the work of all the principal photographers, but Russell Lee's photographs really stood out to me. There were a few things about his work that immediately caught my eye. First, I was drawn to the way he photographed people. I saw a certain sensitivity, a sense of empathy in his portraits, like these two, both taken in Missouri. On the left, I'm showing you Lee's portrait of a former sharecropper being helped by the FSA and moving to a new farm. And here Lee has pictured her on moving day in 1938. On the right, I'm showing you Lee's portrait of a flood refugee displaced by the Great Ohio River flood in 1937. And here Lee has pictured her after she's taken shelter in a schoolhouse. Another aspect of Lee's work that caught my eye was his use of flash. And I'm showing you here two early examples, children of tenant farmers in Iowa in 1936. And most of the homes Lee visited did not have electricity, and often the rooms where he was working had no windows. So to light the spaces, he used flash. And on the left is one of his more famous photographs of children eating a Christmas dinner of potatoes and cabbage. On the right is his portrait of a child sitting on an old bed in an attic room. Now, I'd like to emphasize here that flash photographs of this era did not normally look like this. Flash usually highlighted only the foreground and left the background in darkness. And these photographs really highlight Lee's technical proficiency. He's managed to illuminate the entire space evenly, which gives us an incredible depth of focus and a level of detail. And these two photographs also highlighted for me another aspect about Lee's work that I noticed. He had a special gift for photographing children in distress. But what I really noticed back in 1997, what really pulled me in, was Lee's habit of documenting family photographs on display inside people's homes. And these are just two examples of dozens I came across. Sometimes Lee depicted family members with their portraits, as in the photograph on the left, taken in Texas in 1939. And other times he photographed just the portraits themselves, as in the photograph on the right, taken in an Iowa farmhouse in 1936. I couldn't find much written about Lee back in 1997, but I learned a few things that really piqued my interest. I discovered that he was the most prolific FSA photographer with the longest tenure. And I also learned that he had a tragic childhood and was independently wealthy his entire adult life, which really made me wonder, why would someone who was independently wealthy choose to become a government photographer and live out of their car to document the disadvantaged in America? Around this time, I also discovered that his photographs were appearing in popular culture, but that he was rarely, if ever, credited. His photographs were well known, but he was not. And I'm showing you two examples here. On the left is tenant purchase clients at home, taken in Texas in 1939, which was used in a Microsoft Windows screensaver. And on the right is Lee's photograph, Saturday Night in a Saloon, taken in Minnesota in 1937. And it appeared in the opening credits of the television show Cheers, which by the late 1990s was in worldwide distribution. I wanted to know more, so I decided to research Lee and his photographs. Lee had passed away more than a decade before I started my research, so one of the first things I did was to interview people who knew him. I started with his friends and colleagues who worked with him in the 1930s and 40s, photographers and artists such as Louise Gum, Bernarda Shawn, and Saul Lipson. And the people I spoke with were so happy to talk about Lee. They conveyed their deep respect for him, told me how glad they were that he was finally getting the attention that he deserved. And I also spoke with people who knew him later in his life when he lived in Texas, including former Governor Ann Richards. On the left are a few examples of my early interviews on cassette tape, and this now ancient technology really highlights just how long I've been working on this project. On the right is a snapshot I took of one of my more unusual interviews with a group of Lee's friends from the 1970s and 1980s in Austin, Texas. They took me on a tour of the barbecue places they used to visit with Lee on Friday afternoon, and this is Louis Muller's in Taylor, Texas. I traveled to a lot of other places that were important in Lee's story, including where he was born and spent his early life, the schools he attended, and some of the places he photographed for the FSA. I spent a lot of time in his hometown of Ottawa, Illinois, where I saw the grand Victorian home where he was born, and where I also learned a little bit about his childhood, including the fact that his father left when he was about 7, and 3 years later, his mother was killed when a car struck her down in front of him. Lee then had 5 legal guardians by the time he turned 21. I also visited the extensive family farmland he inherited in LaSalle County, Illinois, including this farm, which I'm showing you at the top left, which he inherited shortly after his mother died. I toured the campuses of Culver Military Academy in Culver, Indiana, where Lee spent his teen years, and Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where Lee studied chemical engineering. And at the right is a snapshot I took of the historic Linderman Library at Lehigh. I also explored some of the places Lee photographed, including the site of his best-known body of work in Pie Town, New Mexico. And at the bottom left is a snapshot I took of my friend Elena photographing an abandoned house in that town. I also did a lot of research in libraries and archives across the country, including Albuquerque, New Mexico, San Marcos, Texas, Ottawa, Illinois, Louisville, Kentucky, and Hyde Park, New York. But the bulk of my library and archive research I did at the Library of Congress. And in addition to the Prints and Photographs Division, I researched multiple collections in the Manuscript Division, Geography and Maps, newspapers and periodicals, rare books, microform, and general collections. And as just one example of the research I did in general collections, I'm showing you a book truck here on the left, and it's filled with textbooks that Lee studied as a chemical engineering student at Lehigh University. And I used these textbooks to learn how he studied methods of scientific observation in the 1920s and how he then translated those methods to his photography in the 1930s. So then with all of this primary source material, I created my own research and writing tools. And at the top right, I'm showing you a calendar of every month Lee worked for the FSA OWI. And at the bottom right are enlargements I made from a 1930s road atlas where I mapped every assignment Lee photographed. Another part of my research involved Lee's relationship with the head of the documentary photography project, Roy Stryker, who hired Lee in 1936. And Stryker, who I'm showing you here at the left, was an economics instructor from Columbia University. And he came to Washington in 1935 to establish the documentary photography project that we now know as the FSA. And his official mission was to document the country's rural problems and the government's programs to address them. But Stryker envisioned something more. He, rather than just recording the country's problems and solutions, he wanted to create a photographic inventory of America. And Lee shared that vision with him. The two men conferred with one another often, as you can see in the photograph on the right. And ultimately, they formed a symbiotic working relationship and a lifelong friendship. Lee worked for Stryker's project for 6 years, from the fall of 1936 to the fall of 1942. Lee photographed the social concerns of the era, including the country's agricultural problems, such as farm tenancy in the Midwest, sharecropping in the South, and migration of farm workers to the West Coast. Lee also pictured the country's ecological catastrophes, and here on the screen I'm showing you three examples. At the top left is an organ stranded in an Indiana cornfield, carried there by the 1937 Ohio River flood. At the bottom left is cut over or deforested land in Michigan that was being sold as farmland. And at the right is a dust storm overtaking a farm in North Dakota. At their core, though, it's important to remember Lee's photographs are always about people. The musician that once played that organ, the farmer who had no other choice but to try and salvage that cut over land, the owner of the barn and livestock, which was now engulfed in dust. And as we saw in earlier slides, Lee had a real gift for photographing people, and he had a particular respect for skilled labor, so he often pictured his subjects at work. And also, Lee, who was white, documented individuals from multiple racial and ethnic groups as part of his comprehensive record of American life. And here I'm showing you just four examples. At the top left is an African American worker in a cotton gin in Arkansas. At the top right is a Jewish American worker at a garment factory in New Jersey. At the bottom left are Mexican American pecan shellers in Texas. And at the bottom right are Native American fishermen in Oregon. Lee also recorded the discrimination and segregation of multiple ethnic and racial groups. For example, he documented the forcible evacuation and internment of Japanese Americans from the Pacific coast in 1942. And at the left, I'm showing you one of his photographs from that series, his portrait of a Japanese American child standing between two armed military police officers at the Santa Anita racetrack near Los Angeles. Lee was also sensitive to African American concerns, repeatedly photographing the country's racial divide. And at the right, I'm showing you his portrait of a young Black man drinking at a segregated water cooler in Oklahoma City in 1939. Lee later wrote that documenting the injustice of segregation was one of his personal objectives as an FSA photographer. Sadly, many of the social problems Lee documented are still with us today, and his photographs continue to be relevant. For example, last summer, Stephen Colbert featured Lee's photograph of the man at the segregated water cooler in his Late Show monologue on racial injustice. Lee strived to create a comprehensive visual record of America, and he excelled at documenting the small town. He made hundreds of pictures of small town life across the country, such as this view of a secondhand tire shop in San Marcos, Texas. Lee also understood the details of American life, the visual elements that Stryker was looking for in his photographic inventory of the country. And Lee later credited Stryker with helping him to recognize the importance of documenting the everyday. Stryker worked with Lee and the other photographers to write shooting scripts that included these details of American life, architecture, ephemera, activities, and objects that he wanted to record, like the barber pole. And here I'm showing you a sampling of Lee's barber pole photographs taken across the United States from Louisiana to Montana. Another detail Lee enjoyed documenting was the store window, which he called a window to the community. Lee made dozens of store window photographs across America, and it's important to remember that for Lee, they were as much about the proprietors who made them and the customers who saw them as they are about the windows themselves. And here I'm showing you just two examples, two very different windows that reflect the socioeconomic circumstances of each community. On the left is a store window in Muskogee, Oklahoma, and I'd like you to notice the peeling paint on the storefront, the rumpled and worn jackets and ties, and the handwritten sign announcing used clothing, shoes for sale, why pay more? Now compare that with the more prosperous window display on the right, taken at a beauty salon in Washington, D.C., where clients could get electrolysis and a variety of colognes, a shampoo and a finger wave for $1.25, and Wrap It All, the aristocrat hair coloring rinse. Lee's photographs show us his keen interest in details of American life, how people lived, and his photographs are really still lifes of society, vignettes of ordinary, everyday objects, like winter clothing hanging next to a telephone in an Iowa farmhouse, or tools of the lumber trade in a logging foreman's quarters in a Wisconsin lumber camp. In all, Lee shot 23,000 photographs across 29 states. In October 1942, he decided he wanted to contribute to the war effort through active military service, so he left Stryker's project to join the Air Transport Command. After the war, he went on to other photographic projects, but he always regarded his FSA years as one of the most important periods of his life, and he later said it was the best job he ever had. He recalled that when people approached him in the field and asked why he was photographing a particular scene, like this view of Main Street in Spencer, Iowa, Lee told them he was taking pictures of the history of today. And with that goal in mind, he created a poignant and lasting visual record of the Great Depression and mobilization for World War II. Lee's photographs show us not only how America looked, but how Lee looked at America. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your great presentation.
My pleasure.
Really appreciate it. Particularly, I was struck when you were speaking how we have honored women nonfiction writers, famous nonfiction writers, but you gave us some nice tools for how you proceeded how you proceeded to do your research, making the list of things and the research into it. That was very helpful and wonderful. So thank you so very much. And if anybody has questions, we didn't have time to take questions today, but if anybody has questions, I'm sure Mary Jane can give you her email in just a moment. And also you can email us on American Women Writers National Museum at awwnm1@gmail.com. And all of our videos are available on www.americanwomenwritersnationalmuseum.org. And a lot of them are also on YouTube, and some of them are on C-SPAN 3, their American History Project. So did you want to give your email, Mary Jane?
Sure. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. You can reach me at mjapple@unm.edu.
Okay.
My university email.
Good. We thank you so very much. Great presentation. Loved it.
My pleasure.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for attending.
Thanks, Janice. Bye-bye.
Signing off.